In April 1861, the United States was pushed into a conflict that would become the deadliest war in the nation's history. The country had been growing rapidly for decades, expanding westward and building new states. But beneath that expansion, a deep division was forming between the North and the South. At the center of that division was the question of slavery and the future of the American economy. Northern states were rapidly industrializing and relied less on slave labor, while the Southern economy depended heavily on large plantations where enslaved people were forced to work. As new territories joined the United States, politicians argued fiercely about whether those territories would allow slavery or ban it. Tensions grew for years, but the crisis reached a breaking point after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, and many Southern leaders believed his presidency threatened their entire social and economic system. Soon after the election, several Southern states announced that they would leave the United States. South Carolina was the first to declare secession, and within months other states followed. These states formed their own government called the Confederate States of America and chose Jefferson Davis as their president. Despite these dramatic events, open war had not yet begun. Both sides prepared for conflict, but many Americans still hoped the crisis could be solved without bloodshed. That hope ended in April 1861 at a military fort located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort was known as Fort Sumter. It was controlled by Union forces loyal to the United States government, but it was surrounded by territory that now belonged to the Confederacy. Confederate leaders demanded that the Union soldiers inside the fort surrender. The commander of the fort, Major Robert Anderson, refused. He had only a small garrison and limited supplies, but he remained loyal to the Union and waited for reinforcement. Confederate forces decided to force the issue. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. Cannons thundered across the harbor as shells exploded around the walls of the fort. The bombardment continued for more than 30 hours. Fires broke out inside the fort, and Union soldiers struggled to control the damage. Eventually, Anderson realized that his men could not hold out any longer. With supplies nearly exhausted and the fort heavily damaged, he agreed to surrender. Remarkably, no soldiers were killed during the bombardment itself, but the attack marked the official beginning of the war. News of the attack spread rapidly across the country. In the North, the assault on Fort Sumter shocked the public and united many people behind the Union government. President Abraham Lincoln quickly called for 75,000 volunteers to join the army and defend the nation. Across the northern states, young men rushed to enlist. Many believed the war would be short and that the Union Army would quickly defeat the rebellion. The reaction in the South was equally powerful. Thousands of volunteers joined Confederate forces, determined to defend their new nation. As the conflict escalated, additional states joined the Confederacy, and the divide between North and South became complete. Families were split apart, communities divided, and the entire nation was drawn into the coming war. What many people did not realize at the time was how long and brutal the conflict would become. The war that began with the bombardment of Fort Sumter would last 4 years and cost more American lives than any other war in the country's history. Massive battles would soon take place across fields, forests, and rivers from Pennsylvania to Mississippi. New weapons and tactics would make the fighting more deadly than ever before. The war also transformed the purpose of the conflict itself. At the beginning, many Northern leaders focused primarily on preserving the Union, but as the war continued, the issue of slavery became impossible to ignore. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate territory were free. This decision changed the meaning of the war and turned it into a struggle not only to preserve the nation, but also to end slavery in the United States. Meanwhile, the Confederacy fought desperately to survive as an independent country. Its leaders hoped that European powers might support them, or that Northern public opinion would eventually force the Union government to negotiate peace. But as the war dragged on, the Confederacy faced increasing shortages of food, supplies, and manpower. The conflict finally came to an end in April 1865 when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The surrender effectively ended the fighting and preserved the United States as a single nation. By the time the war ended, more than 600,000 soldiers had died. Cities were destroyed, economies shattered, and the country faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding after years of conflict. The war had also permanently changed the United States, ending slavery and redefining the relationship between the federal government and the states. Today, the events that began with the attack on Fort Sumter remain one of the most important turning points in American history. The conflict known as the American Civil War reshaped the nation and left a legacy that continues to influence the United States even more than a century later.